Beatrice Zimmerman had just shoved a fistful of dirt into her mouth when she first laid eyes on Thaddeus Xavier. And that single humiliating moment would alter the course of her entire life. The stagecoach that carried her toward her new life in Wyoming territory had broken an axle 3 miles outside Fort Laramie, and while the driver cursed and examined the damage, Beatrice felt the familiar panic rising in her chest like floodwater. She was already 2 days late to meet her intended husband, a man she had never seen except in a single daguerreotype that showed more shadow than substance. The betrothal had been arranged through letters, a desperate arrangement made by her late father's business partner, who wanted her settled and out of his Philadelphia household. At 22 years old, she was considered past her prime by society's cruel standards, and this marriage to a Wyoming merchant was likely her last chance at security. The panic built and built, squeezing her ribs until she could not breathe properly. Her hands trembled as she climbed down from the coach. The other passenger, an older woman traveling to visit her son, paid her no mind. Beatrice walked a few paces away from the road, her vision narrowing to a tunnel, and before she could stop herself, she knelt and grabbed a handful of the dusty Wyoming earth. The soil was gritty and tasted of minerals and grass roots, but the moment it touched her tongue, she felt the panic begin to subside. It was a shameful habit, one she had developed as a child when her mother died, and despite years of trying to stop, the compulsion returned whenever stress overwhelmed her defenses. She was still on her knees, dirt smudging her traveling dress, when she heard the heavy footfalls of a horse approaching. Beatrice looked up, her mouth still full of soil, her cheeks burning with humiliation as her eyes met those of the largest man she had ever seen. He sat astride a massive bay horse, his shoulders so broad they seemed to block out the afternoon sun. His hair fell past his shoulders in dark waves, and his face was weathered and tanned from years of mountain living. Muscles strained against his buckskin shirt, and his forearms, visible where his sleeves were rolled up, were corded with strength that spoke of a life spent wrestling with nature itself. Their gazes locked, and Beatrice saw no judgment in his dark eyes, only a calm curiosity that somehow made the moment even more mortifying. She quickly turned her head and spat out the dirt as discreetly as possible, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. The man dismounted with fluid grace despite his size, landing lightly on his feet. "The axle," he asked the driver in a voice like distant thunder. "Snapped clean through," the driver confirmed. "We will need a replacement from town." "I can fashion something to get you there," the man said, already moving to examine the damage. Beatrice stayed frozen in her spot, hoping he would forget what he had witnessed. But after he had studied the broken axle and retrieved some rope and a thick branch from his saddlebag, he walked directly over to where she still knelt. He crouched down beside her, bringing his face level with hers, and Beatrice found herself staring into eyes that held both kindness and something else she could not name. Up close, she could see the fine lines at the corners of those eyes, the strong cut of his jaw beneath several days of beard growth, and a small scar that traced along his left cheekbone. "You hurt?" he asked quietly, his voice pitched only for her ears. Beatrice shook her head, unable to form words, her throat tight with embarrassment. "The earth here is clean enough," he continued, still in that low, private voice. "But the soil near Sweet Creek, about 2 miles northwest of Fort Laramie, is better, richer, less alkali. If you are going to be living in these parts, you should know where the good earth is." He said it so matter-of-factly, without any trace of mockery or disgust, that Beatrice felt tears spring to her eyes. No one had ever acknowledged her strange compulsion without horror or shame. Most people who had caught her over the years had reacted as though she were possessed or insane. "I am trying to stop," she whispered. "Maybe that is the wrong approach," he said, then stood and returned to help the driver with the repairs. Beatrice remained kneeling for another moment, her heart beating strangely in her chest, before she finally rose and brushed off her skirts. The older woman from the coach was watching her with poorly concealed disgust, but Beatrice found she did not care as much as she usually would. The mountain man's unexpected acceptance had created a small, warm space inside her chest that insulated her from the usual shame. It took Thaddeus less than an hour to rig a temporary repair that would hold until they reached Fort Laramie. He worked with the efficiency of someone who had solved countless problems in wilderness settings, his large hands surprisingly dexterous as they lashed wood and rope together. Beatrice watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the way his muscles flexed with each movement, the way he seemed entirely comfortable in his own skin in a manner she had never experienced herself. When the repair was complete, the driver thanked him profusely, but Thaddeus simply nodded and returned to his horse. Before mounting, however, he looked once more at Beatrice. "You are the bride for Gerald Pritchard?" he asked. Beatrice felt her stomach drop. Gerald Pritchard was indeed the name of her intended husband. "Yes," she managed. "How did you know? Small town. Word spreads. He mentioned expecting a bride from Philadelphia." Thaddeus was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. "He is a successful merchant, well respected." There was something in the way he said it, some subtle emphasis that Beatrice could not quite interpret. Before she could ask, Thaddeus had mounted his horse. "Welcome to Wyoming territory, Miss Zimmerman," he said, and then he rode off toward the mountains that rose like blue shadows in the distance. The stagecoach limped into Fort Laramie as the sun was beginning its descent toward the western peaks. The town was rougher and smaller than Beatrice had imagined. A collection of wooden buildings clustered around a central street, with the old military fort visible in the distance. Established as a fur trading post decades earlier, Fort Laramie had grown into a vital stop along the immigrant trails. Though by 1876, the great westward migrations had slowed, leaving the town with a permanent population of a few hundred souls. Gerald Pritchard was waiting outside the general store, which Beatrice assumed must be his establishment. He was a man of medium height and slight build, probably in his late 30s, with thinning hair and a mustache that he had waxed into precise points. He wore a clean suit that looked out of place in the dusty frontier town, and his hands, when he took hers, were soft and uncalloused. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, his voice nasal and somewhat high-pitched, "I had nearly given up hope. You are quite late." "The stagecoach had mechanical difficulties," Beatrice explained. "I apologize for the delay." "Yes, well, these things happen, I suppose. Come inside. I have arranged for you to stay with Mrs. Holbrook, the widow who runs the boarding house, until our wedding in 3 days. I trust that timeline is acceptable, 3 days. Beatrice felt the panic beginning to stir again but swallowed it down. "Of course, Mr. Pritchard," he smiled, showing small, even teeth. "Please call me Gerald. We are to be married after all. Let me show you the store before I take you to your lodgings." The general store was well organized and clearly successful, stocked with everything from farming implements to fine fabrics. Gerald walked her through the aisles with obvious pride, explaining his inventory system and profit margins in excruciating detail. Beatrice tried to pay attention, but her mind kept drifting back to the mountain man's dark eyes and the casual way he had accepted the worst thing about her, Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house was a neat 2-story structure on the edge of town. The widow herself was a brisk woman in her 50s who showed Beatrice to a small but clean room and informed her that meals were served at 6 in the morning and 6 in the evening, with no exceptions. That first night, lying in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar territory, Beatrice felt the walls of her new life closing in. She had agreed to this arrangement because she had no other options. Her father had died 2 years earlier, leaving debts that consumed what little he had owned. His business partner, Mr. Thornberry, had taken her into his household, but his wife had made it clear that Beatrice was an unwanted burden. When Gerald Pritchard's letter arrived, seeking a refined Eastern bride, Mr. Thornberry had practically pushed Beatrice into the correspondence. She had tried to imagine loving Gerald, or at least finding contentment with him, but after meeting him, she felt only a hollow resignation. He was not cruel or obviously unsuitable. He was simply a man she did not know and could not envision sharing her life with, yet she had no choice but to do exactly that. The panic rose again, and Beatrice pressed her hands against her chest, trying to breathe through it. She had no access to earth here in this second-floor room, and the absence made everything worse. She paced the small space, her heart racing, her breath coming in shallow gasps, until finally exhaustion overcame her, and she collapsed into bed, falling into fitful sleep. The next morning, Gerald collected her after breakfast to introduce her to the town's notable citizens. They visited the doctor, the bank manager, the minister who would perform their wedding ceremony, and various other merchants and their wives. Everyone was polite but reserved, clearly waiting to see what kind of woman this Eastern bride would prove to be. Beatrice smiled until her face hurt and tried to say the right things, but all the while, the stress built inside her like steam in a sealed pot. By afternoon, her hands were trembling. Gerald noticed and frowned. "Are you unwell, Miss Zimmerman?" "I am simply tired from the journey," she lied. "Would it be possible for me to have some time to myself? Perhaps a walk to clear my head?" Gerald looked uncertain. "I suppose that would be acceptable, though a lady should not wander too far alone. Stay within the town proper and be back before dinner." The moment she was free of his presence, Beatrice felt like she could breathe slightly easier. She walked quickly through the town, nodding at the few people she passed, until she reached the outskirts where the buildings gave way to open land. She could see a creek in the distance, lined with cottonwood trees, and something about the description tickled her memory: Sweet Creek. 2 miles northwest of town. Richer soil, less alkali, she should not. It was improper to wander so far alone, and Gerald had specifically told her to stay in town. But the compulsion was building to an unbearable intensity, and Beatrice found her feet carrying her toward the creek before she had consciously made the decision. The walk took nearly 45 minutes, and by the time she reached the creek bank, Beatrice was breathing hard, though whether from exertion or anxiety, she could not say. The area was beautiful, more lush than the land immediately surrounding the town, with thick grass growing along the water's edge and wildflowers dotting the meadow beyond. She looked around to ensure she was alone, then knelt by the creek bank where the soil looked dark and rich. Her hands were shaking as she scooped up a handful. She brought it to her mouth, and the moment the earth touched her tongue, she felt the terrible pressure in her chest begin to ease. She took another handful, and then another, until finally the panic receded enough for her to breathe normally. "It is better here, is it not?" Beatrice nearly choked. She spun around to find Thaddeus Xavier sitting on a large rock about 20 feet away, partially obscured by the shade of a cottonwood tree. He must have been there the entire time, watching her. "I did not mean to startle you," he said, rising to his feet. "I come here most days when I am in town for supplies. It is peaceful. Beatrice wiped her mouth, her face burning. "You must think I am insane. I think you are dealing with something difficult in the only way you know how." He walked closer, and once again Beatrice was struck by his sheer size. He had to be well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to span half the creek. "Have you always done this?" No one had ever asked her that question before. They had only condemned or tried to forcibly stop her. Beatrice found herself answering honestly. "Since I was 7 years old. My mother died of cholera, and the night after her funeral I could not breathe. I felt like I was drowning on dry land. I ran outside and just grabbed the earth from her grave and ate it, and I could breathe again." Thaddeus nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. Grief is a powerful force. Sometimes we need an anchor to keep from being swept away. "It is disgusting," Beatrice said bitterly. "It is the behavior of a madwoman. It is the behavior of someone who found a way to survive." Thaddeus crouched down beside the creek, trailing his fingers through the water. "I have seen stranger things in these mountains. Men who talk to trees. Women who only eat food they have grown with their own hands. A trapper who insists on sleeping on bare rock because anything softer gives him nightmares. We all have our peculiarities. Yours is just more visible than most." Beatrice sank down to sit on the grass, suddenly exhausted. "Mr. Pritchard cannot ever know. He would call off the wedding." Would that be such a terrible thing? The question hung in the air between them. Beatrice looked at this mountain man, this stranger who somehow saw her more clearly than anyone ever had, and felt a dangerous honesty rising in her throat. "I have nowhere else to go. No family, no means of supporting myself. This marriage is my only option." Thaddeus was quiet for a long moment. "Everyone has options. They may not always be easy ones, but they exist." "Not for women," Beatrice said quietly. "Not for women like me. Perhaps not in Philadelphia. But out here, things are different. The rules are not as rigid. A woman with determination can make her own way." He paused. "But I suppose you have not had much opportunity to develop determination. The East teaches women to be dependent." The observation should have offended her, but Beatrice recognized the truth in it. She had been raised to rely on others, first her father, then Mr. Thornberry, and now Gerald Pritchard. The idea of relying on herself seemed as foreign as the Wyoming landscape itself. "I should return to town," she said, though she made no move to stand. "Mr. Pritchard expects me back for dinner." "He is not a bad man," Thaddeus said carefully. "He will provide for you. You will have security." "But not understanding," Beatrice said softly. "Not acceptance." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, some acknowledgement of a connection that neither wanted to name. Thaddeus stood first, extending his hand to help her up. His palm was rough with calluses, and his grip was strong enough that he lifted her to her feet with seemingly no effort at all. "I should not come here again," Beatrice said. "It would not be proper." "Probably not," Thaddeus agreed, "but I will be here tomorrow afternoon nonetheless, in case you need to know more about the local soil conditions." The corner of his mouth lifted slightly, not quite a smile, and Beatrice felt an answering warmth bloom in her chest. She nodded once, not trusting herself to speak, and then walked back toward town, acutely aware of his gaze following her until she crested the first hill. She returned to Mrs. Holbrook's boarding house with 10 minutes to spare before dinner, breathless and flushed and feeling more alive than she had in months. That night, lying in bed, she told herself firmly that she would not return to Sweet Creek. It was foolish and dangerous, and nothing good could come from spending time alone with a man who was not her intended husband, especially a man who made her feel things she had no right to feel. But the next afternoon, when Gerald released her for another walk, Her feet carried her northwest out of town as if they had a will of their own. Thaddeus was there, as he had said he would be, sitting in the same spot with what looked like a journal and pencil in his large hands. He glanced up when she approached, and Beatrice saw something like relief cross his features before his expression settled back into calm neutrality. "Good afternoon, Miss Zimmerman, Mr. Xavier." She sat down on the grass a respectful distance away. "What are you writing?" He held up the journal so she could see the page. It was covered in detailed sketches of plants, with notes written in small, neat handwriting beside each drawing. "I am documenting the local flora. There are plants here that grow nowhere else, and I worry their properties will be lost if someone does not record them." "You are an artist," Beatrice said, surprised. The sketches were beautiful, precisely rendered with an obvious understanding of botanical structure. "I am a mountain man who can draw," Thaddeus corrected. "There is a difference." But she could see he was pleased by her reaction. "My mother was a naturalist. She taught me to observe the world carefully before she died." "How old were you when you lost her?" 15. "Old enough to survive, but young enough that it shaped everything that came after." He closed the journal. "She would have liked you. She would have liked a woman who eats dirt. She would have liked a woman who refuses to apologize for finding her own solutions." Thaddeus leaned back against the rock. "Tell me about Philadelphia. What is it like?" Beatrice described her former home, the crowded streets and tall buildings, the social conventions that governed every interaction, the sense of always being watched and judged. As she talked, she realized how little she missed it, how the constant pressure to conform had been its own kind of suffocation. Thaddeus listened with focused attention, asking occasional questions that showed he was truly interested in her answers, not simply waiting for his turn to speak. It was intoxicating to be heard so completely, and Beatrice found herself sharing things she had never told anyone. Stories from her childhood, her fears about the future, her desperate attempts to become someone acceptable enough to deserve love. "You are already acceptable," Thaddeus said when she finally fell silent. "The problem is not you. It is a world that demands we cut away pieces of ourselves to fit into predetermined shapes." "You sound like a philosopher." "I sound like someone who spent too much time alone in the mountains with only his thoughts for company." But his tone was light, almost teasing. "I came out here 7 years ago after my father died. He left me a little money, enough to buy supplies and trapping equipment. I built a cabin up in the Medicine Bow Range and only come down to Fort Laramie a few times a year for trade." "That sounds lonely," Beatrice said. "Sometimes," Thaddeus admitted, "but also peaceful. In the mountains, I can be exactly who I am without explanation or apology. There is freedom in that." Beatrice thought about the freedom he described, tried to imagine a life where she did not have to hide her compulsions or pretend to be someone more normal, more acceptable. It seemed like a fantasy, as distant and unreachable as the moon. They talked until the shadows grew long, and Beatrice realized with a start that she was dangerously close to being late for dinner. She stood quickly, brushing off her skirts. "I must go. Gerald will worry." Something flickered across Thaddeus's face at the mention of her intended husband. "Will you come tomorrow?" Beatrice knew she should say no. Every moment she spent with Thaddeus made her impending marriage feel more like a prison sentence. But she found herself nodding, helpless against the pull she felt toward this man who saw her clearly and did not look away. Over the next 2 days, Beatrice fell into a pattern. She performed her duties as Gerald's intended with mechanical precision, meeting his associates, discussing wedding arrangements, nodding along as he planned their future together. But every afternoon, she escaped to Sweet Creek, where Thaddeus waited with his drawings and his acceptance, and his way of making her feel like she mattered beyond her ability to be a proper wife. On the third afternoon, the day before her wedding, Beatrice arrived at the creek to find Thaddeus standing in the meadow beyond the cottonwoods, surveying the land with an assessing eye. When he saw her, he beckoned her over. "I have been thinking about what you said," he began without preamble. "About needing the earth when the panic comes. And I thought about how, after you are married, you will not be able to disappear for long walks without questions." Beatrice felt her throat tighten. She had been trying not to think about that exact problem. "So I had an idea," Thaddeus continued. "What if you had a garden? A large one where you could spend time with your hands in the soil every day. It would give you access to earth whenever you needed it, but it would look perfectly normal, expected even. A wife tending her garden." Beatrice stared at him. That is actually quite clever. I am occasionally capable of useful thoughts." He walked a few paces, gesturing to the land around them. "This meadow has good soil, enough sun, access to water from the creek. If it were yours, you could grow enough to keep yourself occupied for hours each day." "But it is not mine. This land must belong to someone." "It belongs to me," Thaddeus said quietly. "I filed claim on this section 3 years ago. I have been using it for summer grazing, but I would be willing to sell you this particular portion. 2 acres, enough for a substantial garden." Beatrice felt her heart begin to race. "I have no money of my own. Everything I have came from Mr. Thornberry's charity." "Then perhaps you could persuade Gerald to purchase it. Tell him you want a garden to occupy your time. Men like Gerald appreciate wives who can provide vegetables and herbs. It would benefit his household." The idea took root in Beatrice's mind. It was perfect, really. A garden would give her the cover she needed to continue accessing earth without suspicion. But more than that, it would give her a place that was hers, a space where she could breathe. "Would you help me establish it?" she asked. "I do not know anything about gardening in this climate." "I know enough to get you started," Thaddeus said. Then, more quietly, "I would like to know you had that place, that you would be all right." The unspoken words hung between them. The wedding was tomorrow. After that, whatever this thing was between them would have to end. They both knew it, but neither wanted to acknowledge it directly. Beatrice felt the panic building, but this time it was not the formless anxiety she usually experienced. This was specific grief, the pain of losing something precious before she had even fully had it. Her hands trembled as she knelt and grabbed a handful of soil, but even as she ate it, she knew it would not be enough to ease this particular hurt. Thaddeus knelt beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his large frame. "Beatrice," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. "You do not have to marry him." "I have to marry someone," she whispered, "and he is here and he is willing." "But you do not love him." "I do not love anyone." She turned to look at him, tears blurring her vision. "I do not know how. I am too broken for that." Thaddeus reached out slowly, telegraphing his movement, and cupped her face with one large hand. His palm was warm against her cheek, and his thumb brushed away a tear with surprising gentleness. "You are not broken. You are just afraid, and that is understandable, but it is not the same thing." Beatrice closed her eyes, leaning into his touch despite herself. "What would you have me do?" "Run away to the mountains with you. Live in a cabin, isolated from everyone. That is no solution." "It could be," Thaddeus said. "If you wanted it to be, I have enough to support 2. The cabin is not large, but it is comfortable. I could teach you to survive out there, to find peace in the wilderness." For a moment, Beatrice let herself imagine it, waking up in a mountain cabin beside this man who accepted her completely. Spending her days learning about plants and animals, her hands in the earth whenever she needed it, no society to judge her, no expectations to fail. It sounded like paradise, but it also sounded terrifying. She barely knew Thaddeus. What if the isolation drove them to hate each other? What if she discovered she could not survive in the wilderness? What if she was simply trading one form of dependence for another? "I cannot," she said, opening her eyes. "I am not brave enough." Thaddeus nodded slowly, his hand falling away from her face. "I understand, but the offer stands. If you change your mind, even after tomorrow, you know where to find me." They sat together in silence as the sun began to set, neither willing to be the first to leave, knowing this was likely their last private moment together. Finally, when the sky had turned deep purple and the first stars were emerging, Beatrice forced herself to stand. "I should go. Gerald is hosting a small dinner tonight with some of his business associates. He wants to introduce me as his soon-to-be wife." Thaddeus walked with her to the edge of the meadow, and there he stopped, as if an invisible line prevented him from going farther. "Be happy, Beatrice, if you can. You deserve happiness." "So do you," she said, then turned and walked back toward town before she could do something foolish like stay. The dinner was exactly as tedious as Beatrice had anticipated. Gerald's associates were pompous men who liked to hear themselves talk, and their wives were brittle women who assessed Beatrice with shrewd eyes and found her wanting. She smiled and nodded and said the right things while feeling like she was watching herself from a great distance, a marionette going through the motions of living. That night, she lay awake in her boarding house room, staring at the ceiling, and tried to make peace with her decision. She was doing the sensible thing, the practical thing. Gerald would provide for her. She would have security, respectability, a place in society. The fact that she did not love him was irrelevant. Most marriages were based on practical considerations rather than affection. She would adjust in time. She would learn to be content. But even as she told herself these things, she felt the panic rising, and this time no amount of earth would calm it, because the thing she was afraid of was the future itself, stretching out before her like a prison sentence. The morning of her wedding dawned clear and bright. Mrs. Holbrook helped her into the dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit Beatrice's slightly smaller frame. It was ivory silk with lace at the collar and cuffs, elegant and refined, and Beatrice barely recognized herself in the mirror. The ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock at the small church on the edge of town. Gerald had arranged for a simple reception afterward at the hotel, with cake and punch for the assembled guests. It was all very proper and appropriate, exactly the kind of wedding a respectable merchant would have. Beatrice walked to the church with Mrs. Holbrook, her hands icy cold despite the warm morning. People were already gathering, curious to see the Eastern bride who had come so far to marry one of their own. She saw the doctor and his wife, the bank manager, various merchants and their families. Everyone who was anyone in Fort Laramie seemed to be in attendance. Gerald waited at the front of the church, looking pleased and proprietary in his best suit. The minister stood beside him, Bible in hand, ready to bind them together for life. Beatrice walked down the short aisle, her feet moving mechanically, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She reached the front of the church. The minister opened his Bible. Gerald reached for her hand, and his touch felt wrong, cold, and possessive rather than comforting. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, "we are gathered here today." Beatrice heard the words as if from a great distance. Her vision was narrowing, the familiar signs of panic overwhelming her. She tried to breathe deeply, but her corset was too tight, the church too small, the weight of all those watching eyes too heavy. To join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. She could not do this. The realization hit her with perfect clarity. She could not spend her life with Gerald Pritchard, pretending to be someone she was not, hiding her true self away like a shameful secret. She would suffocate slowly under the weight of respectability, and eventually, there would be nothing left of her but an empty shell going through the motions of existence. If anyone present knows of any reason why these two should not be joined, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. "I object," Beatrice heard herself say. The church fell silent. Gerald stared at her in confusion. "What? I object," Beatrice repeated louder this time. "I cannot marry you, Mr. Pritchard. I am very sorry, but I cannot." "This is highly irregular," the minister sputtered. "The bride cannot object to her own wedding." "Well, I am objecting nonetheless." Beatrice pulled her hand free from Gerald's grip. "I apologize for the embarrassment this causes you, Mr. Pritchard. You deserve a wife who can love you properly, and I am not that woman." Gerald's face had gone from pale to red. "Have you lost your mind? Where will you go? What will you do?" "I do not know," Beatrice admitted, "but I will figure it out. I am not as helpless as I thought I was." She turned and walked back down the aisle, her heart pounding, whispers erupting all around her. Mrs. Holbrook looked scandalized. The other guests were already gossiping, no doubt gleeful at having witnessed such dramatic impropriety. Beatrice did not care. For the first time in her life, she was making her own choice, and the terror of it was matched only by an unexpected surge of exhilaration. She walked out of the church into the bright Wyoming sunshine and just kept walking. She had no plan, no destination, but her feet seemed to know where they were going. She headed northwest out of town, toward Sweet Creek, lifting her skirts to move faster, practically running by the time she reached the cottonwoods. Thaddeus was not there. Of course he was not there. It was her wedding day. He had no reason to be here. Beatrice sank down onto the grass, her fancy dress pooling around her, and felt the reality of what she had just done crash over her. She had jilted Gerald Pritchard in front of the entire town. She had nowhere to stay, no money, no prospects. She had just destroyed her last chance at security for what? The hope that a mountain man she barely knew might actually want her. She heard hoofbeats and looked up to see Thaddeus riding toward her on his bay horse, moving fast. He must have been on his way out of town, probably heading back to his mountain cabin now that the wedding was over and done with. He pulled his horse to a stop when he saw her and dismounted in one fluid motion. Beatrice. He crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. "What happened?" "Why are you here? The wedding." "I could not go through with it," she said, her voice shaking. "I stood at the altar and realized I would rather have nothing than spend my life pretending to be someone I am not." Thaddeus knelt in front of her, his eyes searching her face. "What are you saying?" "I am saying I chose myself. For the first time in my life, I chose what I wanted instead of what was expected." Beatrice took a shaky breath. "And what I want, what I truly want, is to know you better, to spend time with someone who sees me clearly and does not look away. Even if it means living in a mountain cabin, even if it means learning an entirely new way of life, even if it is terrifying." "Beatrice," Thaddeus said again, and this time her name sounded like a prayer. "Are you sure? This is not an easy life. The winters are hard and the isolation can be difficult. There are dangers in the mountains, and I cannot promise you comfort or security." "I do not need comfort or security," Beatrice said. "I need to be able to breathe. I need to be myself. And somehow you make both of those things possible." Thaddeus reached for her hands, engulfing them in his much larger ones. "I want you to know what you are agreeing to. My cabin is small, just 2 rooms. I spend most of my time trapping and hunting. I am not educated or refined. I cannot offer you the life you were raised to expect." "Good," Beatrice said, "because that life was killing me slowly." Thaddeus studied her face for a long moment, and Beatrice saw the exact instant he made his decision. Something shifted in his expression. A wall coming down, And then he pulled her close, wrapping his massive arms around her in an embrace that felt like coming home. Beatrice buried her face in his chest, breathing in the scent of leather and pine and something uniquely him, and felt the panic that had been her constant companion for so long finally begin to recede. "We should leave soon," Thaddeus said quietly, his chin resting on the top of her head. "Gerald will come looking for you, and he will not be pleased. We can be at my cabin by nightfall if we ride hard." "I should change out of this dress first," Beatrice said, "though I suppose all my belongings are still at the boarding house. We will stop there briefly. You gather what you can carry, and we go. I have spare clothes at the cabin that we can alter to fit you until we can purchase proper things." They moved quickly after that. Thaddeus helped Beatrice onto his horse, then mounted behind her, his arms bracketing her body as he took the reins. They rode into town, and Beatrice was grateful that most people were still at the church or the hotel, waiting to see what would happen next. They stopped at the boarding house, and Beatrice ran inside while Thaddeus waited with the horse. Mrs. Holbrook was there, having apparently left the church as well. "Miss Zimmerman, what is the meaning of this shameful display?" "I am leaving," Beatrice said simply, grabbing her traveling bag and stuffing in what few possessions she had brought from Philadelphia. "Please convey my apologies to Mr. Pritchard." "Leaving? With whom? Where are you going?" Mrs. Holbrook followed her up the stairs, sputtering with indignation. "I am going to live my own life," Beatrice said, "for the first time ever." She did not wait for a response, just ran back down the stairs and out to where Thaddeus waited. He secured her bag to his saddle, then helped her mount again. As they rode out of Fort Laramie heading northeast toward the mountains, Beatrice heard shouting behind them and knew that someone, probably Gerald, had discovered her escape. "Hold on," Thaddeus said, and urged his horse into a gallop. They rode hard for the first hour, putting distance between themselves and any potential pursuit. Thaddeus knew the land intimately, guiding them along paths that were barely visible, through creek beds and over rocky ground that would make tracking difficult. Gradually, the flat plains gave way to rolling hills, which in turn yielded to the mountains themselves, rising like giants around them. Beatrice had never been in mountains before. The scale of them was overwhelming, the peaks stretching toward the sky, covered in pine forests that seemed to go on forever. The air was thinner here, cooler, scented with evergreen and wild grass. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. As they climbed higher, Thaddeus slowed their pace, allowing his horse to pick its way carefully along increasingly narrow trails. He kept one arm wrapped securely around Beatrice's waist, holding her steady, and she found herself leaning back against his solid chest, trusting him completely to keep her safe. They stopped once to rest the horse and allow Beatrice to attend to necessities behind some bushes. When she emerged, Thaddeus handed her a canteen of water and some dried meat from his saddlebag. "How much farther?" she asked. "Another 2 hours, maybe 3. The cabin is in a valley on the far side of that peak." He pointed to a mountain that still looked impossibly distant. "It is well hidden. No one will find us there unless we want them to. You think Gerald will try to follow? Possibly. But he is not an outdoorsman. He will not track us far, and even if he hires someone who can, we will see them coming long before they reach the cabin." Thaddeus took a drink from the canteen. "Are you having second thoughts?" "No," Beatrice said, and realized it was true. Despite the uncertainty of her situation, despite having just abandoned everything she knew, she felt lighter than she had in years. "I am terrified, but I am not doubting." Thaddeus smiled, a real smile that transformed his rugged face into something almost boyish. "Good, Because I should tell you that I have been half in love with you since I saw you eating dirt by the side of the road." Beatrice laughed, a genuine sound of surprised joy. "That is possibly the strangest declaration of affection I have ever heard. I am a strange man. You should probably know that up front. I am a strange woman who eats dirt when stressed. I think we are well matched." They resumed their journey, and as they rode higher into the mountains, Beatrice felt something fundamental shift inside her. The constant anxiety that had defined her existence for so long was still there, but it no longer controlled her. She had taken action. She had chosen her own path. And whatever happened next, at least it would be hers. The sun was low in the sky when they finally reached Thaddeus's cabin. It sat in a small valley carved by a clear stream, surrounded by towering pines and aspens that were just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. The cabin itself was larger than Beatrice had expected, built from thick logs and obviously constructed with care and skill. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, which confused her until Thaddeus explained. "I have a friend who checks on the place when I am gone. Ben Harding, another trapper. He lives about 5 miles south. He must have come by and started a fire so the place would be warm for my return." They dismounted, and Thaddeus helped Beatrice down, his hands lingering at her waist. "Welcome home," he said softly. "Home." The word settled over Beatrice like a warm blanket. She followed Thaddeus inside, and while the cabin was indeed simple, it was also clean and surprisingly comfortable. The main room held a stone fireplace with a fire burning cheerfully, a solid wooden table with 2 chairs, and a rocking chair positioned near the hearth. Shelves lined one wall, filled with books and what looked like more of Thaddeus's botanical journals. A doorway led to a smaller room that held a large bed covered in furs and wool blankets. "It is not fancy," Thaddeus said, watching her examine the space. "But it is solid and warm, and the location is beautiful." "It is perfect," Beatrice said honestly. "I cannot imagine anything more perfect." Thaddeus's expression softened. He reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "Beatrice, I need to say something. I know today has been overwhelming, and I do not want you to feel pressured into anything. You are welcome here as long as you want to stay, with no expectations. If you decide you want to return to Fort Laramie or go back east, I will help you do that. You are not obligated to me just because I offered you refuge." Beatrice squeezed his hand. "I understand, but I do not want refuge. I want—" She hesitated, trying to find the right words. "I want to build something new with you if you want that too." "I do," Thaddeus said immediately. "I want that more than I have wanted anything in a very long time, but I also want to do this properly. Court you the way you deserve to be courted. Give you time to be sure." "I am already sure," Beatrice said, stepping closer to him. "I was sure when I walked out of that church. I was sure when I chose you over the safe, respectable option. I am not good at many things, but I am good at recognizing truth when I feel it, and this is true." Thaddeus raised his free hand to cup her face, his thumb brushing along her cheekbone. "You are remarkable," he said. "Do you know that? Most people spend their whole lives afraid to choose what they truly want, but you found the courage to do it." "Only because you showed me it was possible," Beatrice said. "You accepted the worst thing about me without judgment. That changed everything." They stood there, hands joined, gazes locked, and Beatrice felt the moment stretch and deepen into something significant. Then Thaddeus leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted, and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both gentle and sure. Beatrice had been kissed before, chased pecks from suitors that felt more obligatory than passionate, but this was entirely different. Thaddeus kissed like he did everything else, with complete focus and intensity, as if she were the only thing in the world that mattered. His arms came around her, lifting her slightly off the ground, and Beatrice wrapped her hands in his long hair and kissed him back with all the pent-up longing she had been suppressing for days. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Thaddeus rested his forehead against hers. "I will build you that garden," he said. "The largest, most beautiful garden in the territory. Whatever you need to feel safe and calm, I will provide it." "I just need you," Beatrice whispered. "Everything else is extra." But over the following weeks, Thaddeus proved himself a man of his word. While Beatrice adjusted to life in the mountains, learning to cook over the fireplace and help with daily chores, Thaddeus began preparing a plot of land near the cabin for her garden. He cleared rocks and roots, enriched the soil with compost, built a fence to keep out deer and other animals. He worked from dawn until dusk, his powerful body moving with practiced efficiency, and Beatrice found herself mesmerized by watching him. Ben Harding came by a week into their new arrangement, ostensibly to welcome Beatrice, but really to ensure his friend had not made a terrible mistake. He was a wiry man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a cautious manner, but after spending an afternoon talking with Beatrice while Thaddeus hunted, he seemed to relax. "You are not what I expected," Ben admitted as he was preparing to leave. Thaddeus said he had brought back a runaway bride, and I thought. He shrugged. "I do not know what I thought, but you seem sensible, and you make him happy. I have not seen him this content in all the years I have known him." "He makes me happy too," Beatrice said. "Happier than I knew was possible." After Ben left, Thaddeus seemed more settled, as if his friend's approval had confirmed something for him. That night, as they sat by the fire after dinner, he pulled Beatrice into his lap in the rocking chair and held her close. "I want to marry you," he said quietly, "properly with vows and everything, but I know you just escaped one wedding and I do not want to rush you." "I did not escape marriage," Beatrice corrected. "I escaped the wrong marriage. With you, it would be entirely different." "We should still wait," Thaddeus said. "Give you time to be absolutely certain. The mountains can be harsh in winter. You should experience that before making permanent promises." Beatrice nodded, understanding his caution even as part of her wanted to protest. They had time. There was no need to rush. The garden was completed by early September, and Thaddeus presented it to her with quiet pride. It was easily a quarter-acre, the soil dark and rich, bordered by stones that Thaddeus had carried from the stream. He had even built raised beds in various sections, explaining that different plants preferred different conditions. "It is too late in the season to plant much this year," he said. "But we can put in some cold weather crops, and next spring you can grow whatever you want. Vegetables, herbs, flowers, whatever brings you peace." Beatrice stood in the center of the garden plot, her hands sinking into the soft earth, and felt tears stream down her face. No one had ever done something so thoughtful for her, had ever worked so hard to accommodate her peculiarity rather than trying to eliminate it. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for seeing me." Thaddeus pulled her into his arms, and they stood together in the garden as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Over the following months, Beatrice learned to live in harmony with the wilderness that surrounded her. She learned to identify animal tracks, to predict weather by reading the sky, to preserve food for winter and treat minor injuries with poultices made from local plants. Thaddeus was an endlessly patient teacher, and Beatrice discovered that she had a natural aptitude for the practical skills required for mountain living. She also learned about Thaddeus himself, the layers of complexity beneath his calm exterior. He read voraciously, working through the collection of books that lined his shelves, and enjoyed discussing philosophy and natural science. He played the harmonica in the evenings, simple folk songs that filled the cabin with music. He had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. And he was unfailingly gentle with her, attuned to her moods, knowing when she needed space and when she needed the comfort of his presence. When winter came, it was indeed harsh. Snow fell for days at a time, blocking the cabin in, and temperatures dropped far below anything Beatrice had experienced in Philadelphia. But the cabin was snug and well stocked with supplies, and Beatrice found she did not mind the isolation. She spent her days cooking, reading, working on a quilt she was sewing, and talking with Thaddeus about everything and nothing on Christmas Eve. Thaddeus surprised her with a gift, a delicate necklace he had traded for at Fort Laramie during one of his rare supply runs. The pendant was a small silver flower worked with surprising detail. "It is a Pasqua flower," he explained as he fastened it around her neck. "The first flower that blooms in spring, even when there is still snow on the ground. It symbolizes hope and new beginnings." Beatrice touched the pendant, emotion tightening her throat. "I have nothing to give you." "You gave me yourself," Thaddeus said simply. "That is more than enough." That night, as they lay in bed with the wind howling outside, Beatrice finally told him the full story of her life, things she had never shared with anyone. The desperate poverty after her father died. The way Mr. Thornberry's wife had made her feel like a burden and a charity case. The suitors who had courted her briefly before deciding she was too strange, too damaged. The years of trying to suppress her compulsion, the shame that had become her constant companion. Thaddeus listened to all of it, his arms around her, occasionally pressing kisses to her hair. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment before speaking. "I am glad you ate dirt by the side of the road that day," he said. "I am glad you were exactly who you are, because if you had been anyone else, we might never have found each other." Beatrice turned in his arms to face him. "I love you," she said. "I do not know if I have said that clearly enough, but I love you, completely." "I love you too," Thaddeus said, his voice rough with emotion. "I have loved you since the moment you looked at me with dirt on your mouth and fear in your eyes, and I thought you were the bravest person I had ever met." They made love that night with a tenderness that brought tears to Beatrice's eyes, and afterward, wrapped in his arms, she felt a contentment so complete it almost frightened her. She had not known life could be this way, simple and hard and absolutely perfect all at once. The winter passed, and spring came with an explosion of life. Wildflowers covered the meadows, including the Pasqua flowers that matched Beatrice's necklace. Birds returned, filling the air with song. The stream that ran past the cabin swelled with snowmelt, and the world seemed renewed. Beatrice planted her garden with seeds Thaddeus had ordered specially, along with starts Ben had brought from his own garden. She worked the soil with her hands, feeling it beneath her fingernails, breathing in the rich smell of earth and growing things. The panic that had once driven her to eat soil now rarely appeared. When it did, she would kneel in her garden and run her hands through the dirt, and that was usually enough. On the rare occasions when it was not, Thaddeus would find her and hold her until the panic passed, never judging, always accepting. On a morning in late May, Thaddeus woke her before dawn and led her outside to the garden. He had built an arbor over the entrance at some point without her noticing, and it was now covered in climbing roses he must have transplanted from somewhere. "Beatrice Zimmerman," he said, taking both her hands in his. "I know we said we would wait, but I cannot wait any longer. You have shown me that you can thrive here, that this life suits you. Will you marry me? Will you be my wife in truth, not just in practice?" "Yes," Beatrice said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They rode to Fort Laramie the next week to speak with the minister and arrange a proper wedding. Beatrice was nervous about facing the town again after her scandalous departure, but she found that most people were more curious than judgmental. Gerald had left town months earlier, accepting a position in Denver, and without his presence, the gossip had died down. Mrs. Holbrook sniffed disapprovingly when she saw Beatrice, but said nothing. They were married on a Saturday in June, with Ben Harding and his wife as witnesses. It was a simple ceremony, nothing like the elaborate wedding that had been planned with Gerald, but it was perfect. Beatrice wore a simple dress of pale blue calico, and Thaddeus had trimmed his hair and beard, though he still looked like exactly what he was, a mountain man unused to towns and their conventions. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Thaddeus kissed her with such enthusiasm that Ben laughed, and several people in attendance applauded. They held a small celebration at the hotel afterward, and Beatrice was surprised by how many people came to wish them well. It seemed that her decision to choose her own path had earned her a grudging respect, even among those who would never make such a bold choice themselves. They returned to the cabin that evening as the sun was setting, and Thaddeus carried her over the threshold despite her laughing protests. "We have been living together for months," she said. "This is a bit late for that tradition." "I do not care," Thaddeus said. "You are my wife now, properly and officially, and I am going to observe the tradition." Their first year of marriage passed in a rhythm of seasons and simple joys. Beatrice's garden flourished, providing more vegetables than they could use, so she began preserving and trading the excess in town. She discovered she had a talent for it, and soon people were requesting her canned goods specifically. It gave her a sense of purpose and contribution that felt deeply satisfying. Thaddeus continued his trapping and hunting, but he also began taking on other work, guiding hunting parties in the fall and helping local ranchers with difficult jobs that required his particular combination of strength and wilderness skill. He was gone for a few days at a time occasionally, and Beatrice found she could manage on her own, though she always missed him and welcomed his return with enthusiasm. By the following spring, Beatrice realized she was pregnant. She told Thaddeus one morning as they worked together in the garden, and his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He lifted her up and spun her around, laughing with pure joy, then immediately set her down carefully as if she might break. "I am not fragile," she said, amused. "Pregnancy is not an illness." "I know," Thaddeus said, "but I am allowed to be cautious with the woman carrying my child." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Beatrice found that working in her garden actually helped with the anxiety she sometimes felt about becoming a mother. She would kneel in the soft earth, her hands covered in soil, and imagine the child growing inside her. And somehow that connection to life and growth made everything feel more manageable. Their son was born in early winter, delivered with the help of a midwife Thaddeus had brought from town. It was a long labor, and there were moments when Beatrice thought she might not survive it, but finally, as dawn broke over the mountains, their baby entered the world with a lusty cry. "A boy," the midwife announced, placing the infant on Beatrice's chest. "A healthy, strong boy." Beatrice looked down at her son, his tiny face red and wrinkled, his eyes squeezed shut, and felt a love so fierce it took her breath away. Thaddeus knelt beside the bed, his large hand cradling the baby's head with infinite gentleness, tears streaming down his face. "What should we name him?" Beatrice asked. "Whatever you want," Thaddeus said. "You did the hard part." They named him Samuel after Beatrice's father, and he was a calm, observant baby who seemed to take in the world with serious eyes. As he grew, it became clear he had inherited his father's size and his mother's thoughtful nature. He was fascinated by everything, especially the natural world around him. By the time Samuel was 2, Beatrice was pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter they named Rose, after the climbing roses on the garden arbor where Thaddeus had proposed. Rose was as spirited as her brother was calm, full of energy and opinions from the moment she was born. She kept them on their toes in a way Samuel never had, but she also filled the cabin with laughter and life. The years passed in a blur of seasons and milestones. Samuel's first words, Rose's first steps, the year they all traveled to Denver to see the city, the winters that seemed endless, the springs that always felt like miracles. Beatrice's garden expanded until it was nearly an acre, and she became known throughout the region for her produce and preserves. Thaddeus built additions onto the cabin as their family grew, creating more space for their children and the life they were building together. Through it all, Beatrice's compulsion to eat dirt faded almost entirely. She still felt anxiety from time to time, but the garden provided all the connection to earth she needed. She would kneel in the soil, her hands deep in the dirt, and feel grounded and calm. Thaddeus had given her exactly what she needed, and in doing so, had healed something in her she had not known could be healed. One evening, when Samuel was 10 and Rose was 8, the family sat around the dinner table in the expanded cabin, and Samuel asked his mother about the strange necklace she always wore. "Why is it a flower covered in snow?" he asked, reaching to touch the silver pasquiflower pendant. Beatrice glanced at Thaddeus, who was smiling at her across the table. "It is a symbol," she said carefully. "It represents hope and new beginnings, even in difficult times." "Your mother wore this necklace the first winter we spent together," Thaddeus added. "Before we were married, when she was learning to live in the mountains." "Were you scared?" Rose asked. "Living somewhere new without knowing anyone." "Terrified," Beatrice admitted, "but also more alive than I had ever felt. Sometimes the best things in life are scary at first." "Like when I learned to climb that big pine tree," Samuel said thoughtfully. "I was scared, but then I got to the top and could see everything." "Exactly like that," Beatrice said, reaching over to ruffle his hair. After the children went to bed, Beatrice and Thaddeus sat together in the rocking chair by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his arms wrapped around her. The cabin was quiet except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional sounds of the children settling into sleep. "We have built a good life," Thaddeus said quietly. "Have I told you that lately?" "Only about 100 times," Beatrice said, smiling, "but I never get tired of hearing it." "I think about that day I saw you eating dirt by the side of the road," Thaddeus continued. "And I wonder what would have happened if I had just ridden past, if I had not stopped to help with the stage coach." "But you did stop," Beatrice said. "And you saw me at my worst and you did not look away. That changed everything." "You changed everything," Thaddeus corrected. "You were brave enough to choose yourself, even when it meant walking away from security and respectability. That is not a small thing." "I had help," Beatrice said. "You showed me there was another option. You grew me a garden so I could have the earth I needed. You gave me space to be myself without shame." "I gave you what you deserved," Thaddeus said. "What everyone deserves but few people ever get, unconditional acceptance." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Outside, an owl hooted in the darkness and the wind whispered through the pines. Beatrice thought about the girl she had been, terrified and eating dirt by the side of a road, about to marry a man she did not love. That girl seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. "Do you ever miss Philadelphia?" Thaddeus asked. "The civilization, the culture?" "Never," Beatrice said honestly. "I miss what I thought I wanted before I knew better, but I do not miss the reality of it, the constant pressure to be someone I was not." "This life," This wild, simple, difficult life is exactly where I am meant to be. The following spring, when Beatrice was 30 years old, something unexpected happened. A letter arrived from Philadelphia, forwarded through Fort Laramie, from a lawyer informing her that Mr. Thornberry had died and left her a sum of money in his will. It was not a fortune, but it was substantial, along with an apologetic note from Mrs. Thornberry saying she had always felt guilty about how Beatrice had been treated. Beatrice stared at the letter for a long time, trying to sort through her feelings. The money would help, certainly. They could expand Thaddeus's trapping operation, or improve the cabin further, or set aside funds for the children's future. But more than the practical benefits, the letter represented a kind of closure. The people from her old life had acknowledged, however belatedly, that she had deserved better. "What do you want to do with it?" Thaddeus asked, reading over her shoulder. "I want to buy the land around Sweet Creek," Beatrice said immediately. "The meadow where you first told me about the good soil. I want to own it properly, legally, so it can never be sold or developed. I want to preserve it as it is." Thaddeus pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple. "That is perfect. We can file the claim next time we go to town." They did exactly that, purchasing 40 acres that included the meadow, the creek, and the surrounding forest. Beatrice felt a deep satisfaction in owning the place where her life had truly begun. She began taking the children there regularly, teaching them about plants and soil, about the way certain places could hold meaning beyond their physical attributes. Samuel developed a talent for drawing plants, much like his father, and he would spend hours at Sweet Creek sketching the wildflowers and trees. Rose preferred to explore, climbing rocks and wading in the creek, always looking for adventure. Watching them, Beatrice felt grateful that her children would grow up knowing they were allowed to be exactly who they were, without shame or apology. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thaddeus surprised Beatrice by taking her back to Sweet Creek for a picnic, just the two of them. Ben and his wife watched the children, and Beatrice and Thaddeus spent the day as they had spent those afternoons before her failed wedding, talking and laughing and simply being together. "You remember what you said to me here?" Beatrice asked, lying in the grass with her head on his lap. "When I told you I was not brave enough to run away with you." "I said the offer stood," Thaddeus replied, running his fingers through her hair, which had grown long and was now threaded with a few silver strands, "that even after the wedding you could find me." "And I did," Beatrice said softly. "I found you and you gave me everything I needed, not just the garden, though that was important, but acceptance, understanding, love without conditions. You gave me the same things," Thaddeus said. "Before you, I was content in my isolation, but I was also lonely in ways I did not acknowledge. You brought life and purpose to this mountain." They stayed at Sweet Creek until the stars came out, wrapped in blankets, talking about their past and their future. They discussed plans for when the children were grown, trips they wanted to take, improvements to the cabin and garden. But mostly they just appreciated the moment, this quiet evening in the place where their story had truly begun. Years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and joys. Samuel grew into a tall, quiet young man who inherited his father's love of wilderness and his mother's artistic sensibility. At 18, he announced his intention to become a surveyor, mapping the mountain regions that were still largely uncharted. Rose, at 16, declared she wanted to study medicine, inspired by the midwife who had delivered her, and by watching her mother treat various ailments with herbs from the garden. Beatrice and Thaddeus supported both their children in their ambitions, proud of their independence and determination. They had raised them to think for themselves, to follow their passions, and to never apologize for being who they were. Watching them prepare to leave home was bittersweet, but Beatrice found comfort in knowing they would carry the lessons learned in these mountains wherever they went. When Samuel left for his surveying work and Rose departed for nursing school in Denver, the cabin felt empty in a way it never had before. Beatrice walked through the suddenly quiet rooms and felt a melancholy she had not anticipated. "It is strange," she said to Thaddeus one evening. "I spent so many years overwhelmed by their energy and needs, and now I miss the chaos." "We did well," Thaddeus said. "They are good people, strong and kind and capable. That is what parenting is supposed to accomplish." "I know," Beatrice said. "But knowing it intellectually and feeling it emotionally are different things." Thaddeus pulled her into his arms. "We have time now. Time to remember what it was like when it was just us. Time to work on projects we put aside when the children were small. Time to simply be together without always having to think about someone else's needs." He was right, of course. Over the following months, Beatrice and Thaddeus rediscovered the rhythms of their early marriage. They took long walks through the mountains, sometimes gone for days at a time, camping under the stars and talking about everything and nothing. Beatrice expanded her garden further, experimenting with new varieties of plants. Thaddeus began writing a comprehensive guide to the flora and fauna of the Medicine Bow Range, combining his drawings with detailed observations. They also began spending more time in Fort Laramie, which had grown considerably over the years. The town now had a proper school, several churches, and a railroad connection that brought goods and people from across the country. Beatrice developed friendships with other women in town, something she had never really had before, and found she enjoyed the social connection more than she would have expected. But no matter how much time they spent in town, they always returned to the mountain cabin and the garden with relief. That was home, would always be home, the place where they could be most fully themselves. Their children visited when they could. Samuel returned between surveying expeditions with stories of unmapped valleys and hidden lakes. Rose came home on school breaks, full of medical knowledge and passionate about bringing better health care to rural areas. Both of them seemed happy and fulfilled, living lives they had chosen for themselves rather than accepting what had been handed to them. When Beatrice was 45, she realized with some surprise that she had now lived more of her life in Wyoming than she had in Philadelphia. The frightened girl who had eaten dirt by the side of the road seemed like a distant memory, someone she had been in another lifetime. She was stronger now, both physically and emotionally, capable of things that would have terrified her younger self. She mentioned this to Thaddeus one morning as they worked together in the garden, which had become as much his project as hers over the years. He straightened from where he was weeding between the rows, his hair now liberally streaked with silver, his body still powerful despite the years. "You were always strong," he said. "You just needed the chance to prove it to yourself." "I think we both know that is generous," Beatrice said. "I was a mess when we met." "You were scared," Thaddeus corrected. "That is not the same as weak. You had survived a childhood trauma, years of social pressure, and the loss of everything familiar. And when pushed to the breaking point, you chose yourself. That is strength, Beatrice. That has always been strength." Beatrice set down her trowel and crossed to where he stood, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her head against his chest. Even after all these years, his embrace still felt like the safest place in the world. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For everything. For seeing me when I felt invisible. For accepting what everyone else rejected. For growing me a garden when I needed earth more than I needed air. For building this life with me." Thaddeus held her close, his chin resting on top of her head. "Thank you for being brave enough to choose it. For trusting me when you had every reason not to. for bringing joy and purpose to my mountain, for giving me a family I never knew I wanted. You made my life into something beautiful." They stood there in the garden as the morning sun warmed their backs, two people who had found each other in unlikely circumstances and built something extraordinary from that improbable beginning. Around them, vegetables grew in neat rows, flowers bloomed in colorful profusion, and the rich earth that had once been a source of shame had become a symbol of healing and growth. Samuel got married when he was 23, to a practical woman he had met during one of his surveying expeditions. They lived a nomadic life, moving from site to site, but they visited the mountain cabin several times a year. 2 years later, they had a baby girl they named Beatrice after her grandmother, and Beatrice found that being a grandmother was somehow even more rewarding than being a mother had been. Rose completed her nursing training and opened a small clinic in Fort Laramie, determined to provide medical care to people who otherwise would have had to travel days to see a doctor. She married at 25, a teacher who had moved to Wyoming from Ohio, and they had a son and then twin daughters in quick succession. As Beatrice moved into her 50s, she found herself surrounded by the kind of large, loving family she had never had as a child. Her children and grandchildren filled the cabin during holidays and special occasions, bringing noise and laughter, and the beautiful chaos of multiple generations living and loving together. One summer evening, when the cabin was full of family, Beatrice stepped outside to her garden for a moment of peace. She knelt in the soft earth, her hands sinking into the soil she had tended for more than 3 decades, and felt a contentment so profound, it brought tears to her eyes. She heard footsteps behind her and knew without looking that it was Thaddeus. He sat beside her in the dirt, unconcerned about his clothes, and took her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfect," Beatrice said. "I was just thinking about how far I have come. The girl I was would never have believed this life was possible. A man who loves me completely, children who are happy and healthy, grandchildren to spoil, this garden, this land, this mountain. It is more than I ever dreamed of having." "You deserved all of it," Thaddeus said. "You deserve more." Beatrice laughed softly. "I do not think I could handle more. This is exactly enough." They sat together in the garden as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. From inside the cabin, they could hear their family, the grandchildren's laughter, Samuel's deep voice telling a story, Rose's quick response that made everyone laugh. "We built this," Beatrice said wonderingly. "From nothing, from a chance meeting on a dusty road, we built all of this." "You built it," Thaddeus said. "You were brave enough to break the pattern, to choose something different. I just provided the space for you to grow into who you were always meant to be." Beatrice turned to look at him, this mountain man who had changed her life simply by accepting her exactly as she was. His face was lined now, weathered by decades of mountain living, but his eyes still held the same kindness and understanding that had drawn her to him in the first place. "I love you," she said. "After all these years, through everything we have experienced together, I love you more now than I did at the beginning." "I love you too," Thaddeus said. "You are my greatest adventure, Beatrice Xavier. The best decision I ever made was stopping to help that broken stagecoach." They returned to the cabin hand in hand, joining their family for dinner around the expanded table Thaddeus had built to accommodate everyone. The meal was loud and chaotic, with conversations overlapping and grandchildren interrupting, and the general cheerful disorder of a large family gathering. After everyone had eaten and the children had been put to bed, the adults sat around the fire while Samuel told stories of his latest surveying expedition. Beatrice watched her family, these people who existed because she had been brave enough to choose differently, and felt a satisfaction deeper than words could express. Late that night, after everyone had retired to the various sleeping spaces throughout the expanded cabin, Beatrice and Thaddeus lay in their bed, the same bed they had shared for more than 3 decades. Through the open window, they could hear the creek and the wind in the pines, the eternal sounds of the mountain that had become the soundtrack of their lives. "You remember what you said to me the day we met?" Beatrice asked quietly. "About knowing where the good earth was." "I remember," Thaddeus said. "Sweet Creek, 2 miles northwest of Fort Laramie, rich soil, less alkali." "You were right about more than the dirt," Beatrice said. "You knew where I needed to be, what I needed to heal. You saw me eating dirt and somehow understood that I needed earth, not judgment. That one act of understanding changed my entire life." Thaddeus pulled her closer. "You changed mine too. I was content in my solitude, but I was not truly happy. You brought happiness. You brought life." "We brought it to each other," Beatrice said. "That is what love is, I think. 2 people helping each other become their best selves, supporting each other through the hard times and celebrating each other during the good ones, building something together that neither could have built alone." "That is exactly what love is," Thaddeus agreed. "And we have built something extraordinary." As Beatrice drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, surrounded by family in the cabin they had built together, she thought about that terrified girl who had eaten dirt by the side of a road all those years ago. She wished she could go back and tell that girl that everything would be all right, that she would find love and acceptance and purpose beyond anything she could imagine. But perhaps that girl had needed to be exactly that frightened, exactly that desperate, to have the courage to choose differently. Perhaps every moment of pain and shame had been necessary to bring her to this mountain, to this man, to this beautiful, improbable life. The years continued to pass, gentle and sweet. Beatrice and Thaddeus grew older together, their bodies slowing down but their love never diminishing. They celebrated 50 years of marriage surrounded by children, grandchildren, and even a few great-grandchildren. And Beatrice looked around at the gathering and marveled that all of these people existed because she had been brave enough to walk out of a church and into an uncertain future. Thaddeus remained strong and capable well into his 70s, still chopping wood and maintaining the cabin and working in the garden beside his wife. Beatrice's hair turned silver, and her hands became gnarled with age, but she could still tend her plants and preserve her vegetables and find peace with her fingers in the earth. They never left the mountain permanently, though they traveled occasionally to visit children and grandchildren. But they always returned to the cabin, to the garden, to Sweet Creek and the meadow where their story had truly begun. It was their place, the physical representation of everything they had built together. One autumn morning, when Beatrice was 78 years old and Thaddeus was 82, they walked together to Sweet Creek for what would be the last time. The leaves on the aspens were gold, the air crisp with the promise of winter, and the creek ran clear and cold over smooth stones. They sat in their favorite spot, holding hands, watching the water flow past. Thaddeus was frailer than he used to be, his breathing more labored, and Beatrice knew without being told that their time together was drawing to a close. The knowledge was painful, but also oddly peaceful. They had had so many years, so many good years, that it seemed greedy to ask for more. "No regrets?" Thaddeus asked, his voice softer than it used to be but still carrying that deep timbre she loved. "Not a single one," Beatrice said. "You?" "Only that I did not meet you sooner," Thaddeus said. "I would have liked a few more decades with you." "We got to grow old together," Beatrice said. "So many people do not get that. We were lucky." "We were," Thaddeus agreed. He squeezed her hand. "Promise me you will be all right when I am gone." That you will keep living, keep working in your garden, keep being the remarkable woman I married." "I promise," Beatrice said, tears streaming down her face. "But only if you promise that you will know, wherever you go, that you saved my life, that you showed me what love really is. That everything good in my life came from that moment when you looked at me eating dirt and decided to help instead of judge." "I promise," Thaddeus said. "Though I think you saved yourself, I just gave you a place to do it." They sat together at Sweet Creek until the sun began to set, and then they walked slowly back to the cabin, supporting each other over the uneven ground. That night, Thaddeus died peacefully in his sleep, with Beatrice holding his hand and their children gathered around them. The funeral was well attended, with people coming from all over the territory to pay their respects to the mountain man who had helped so many people over the years. They buried him in a spot he had chosen himself, overlooking the valley with a view of the mountains he had loved. Beatrice stood at the graveside with her children supporting her and felt a grief so profound. It seemed impossible that she would survive it. But survive it she did, because she had promised Thaddeus she would. She continued living in the cabin, tending her garden, welcoming her family when they visited. She often walked to Sweet Creek and sat in the spot where she and Thaddeus had spent so many afternoons, talking to him as if he could hear her, drawing comfort from the earth that had sustained her for so many years. On a spring morning when Beatrice was 83, she died in her garden with her hands in the soil and a smile on her face. Her children found her there, peaceful and content, surrounded by the new growth of spring. They buried her beside Thaddeus on the hillside, and they carved both their names on a stone that would mark the spot for generations to come. The cabin and land passed to Samuel, who maintained them with the same care his father had shown. He brought his grandchildren there and told them stories of their great-grandparents, the mountain man and the woman who ate dirt, who had found each other in improbable circumstances and built a love that became legend in the family. Sweet Creek Meadow was preserved as Beatrice had wanted, protected land that would never be developed, remaining wild and beautiful. Over the years, it became known locally as Beatrice's Garden, a place where people came when they needed peace, when they needed to feel grounded, when they needed to remember that healing was possible. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the light slanted through the cottonwoods just right, visitors to the meadow would swear they could see two figures sitting by the creek, holding hands and talking as they watched the water flow past, together for eternity in the place where their love story had truly begun.